Hey, what's up, people? Piz out here, and today I want to talk to you guys about 1979's When a Stranger Calls. Now, this is partially going to be a review of the movie as well as a review of the new Second Sight Films Blu-ray release. And whether or not you've seen When a Stranger Calls, I'm sure you're aware of the movie's opening act, in which a young babysitter played by Carol Kane is harassed by threatening phone calls. It's eventually revealed that the perpetrator of said threatening phone calls is a lot closer to her than she realizes when we get the famous line, "The phone calls are coming from inside the house." Now, When a Stranger Calls gets credit for originating this now famous line. However, I do believe, to the best of my knowledge, that Bob Clark's Black Christmas was the first film that used this line. However, When a Stranger Calls gave it meme status. And the opening sequence of When a Stranger Calls is a pretty great piece of filmmaking. Co-writer and director Fred Walton does an excellent job of creating suspense and slowly ratcheting up the tension as the sequence goes along. The cinematography is fantastic. The lighting, or the lack thereof, really makes even the most mundane room look like an ominous death trap. The score is eerie. You've got some great music in this film, and Carol Kane's performance is just absolutely fantastic. In other words, the opening 20 minutes or so of When a Stranger Calls is fantastic. Now, the movie does slow down quite considerably after this point when we follow Charles Durning's private detective character as he's tasked to track down the stranger, Kurt Duncan, 6 years later after he's escaped a mental institution. Charles Durning and Tony Beckley's performances are both great, particularly Tony Beckley as the stranger Kurt Duncan. He's not your typical psychotic killer archetype. He really plays the character in a way that's more akin to like a sad, lonely, lost dog. And because of this, you feel sorry for this character despite how heinous his crimes were. And even though you feel sorry for this character because he's pitiful, Beckley does an excellent job of reminding the audience from time to time, very subtly, that there's just something very off about this character and that madness is slowly overwhelming him. When a Stranger Calls sports a great supporting cast, including Colleen Dewhurst and Ron Superfly O'Neill. The movie is directed with a steady hand by Fred Walton. The cinematography is great. The score is great. The acting is great. The movie gets off to a really strong start, and even though it never quite reaches the same levels of tension or suspense that it does during that opening act, I still highly recommend When a Stranger Calls. It's a really interesting, unique kind of pre-slasher era psychological thriller. If you've not seen When a Stranger Calls, I recommend it. This new Blu-ray release from Second Sight Films would be a great way to introduce yourself to the movie. If you're a fan of When a Stranger Calls, you definitely want to look in to picking up the Second Sight Films Blu-ray release and adding it to your collection. Now, I can't tell you anything about the packaging or the presentation of the Blu-ray release. Second Sight Films sent me a check disc for the purposes of this review. However, the film does sport a brand new restoration and scan, and I gotta tell you, it looks absolutely fantastic. This is probably the best When a Stranger Calls will ever look, sans a full-on 4K UHD release of the movie. The darks are substantial, particularly during the opening sequence of the film. There's a nice grain in this scan and restoration as well that gives it kind of an authenticity, letting you know that you are watching, an older film that was actually shot on film. It does get a little grainy-er during close-ups or in some of the darker shots, but overall the picture quality on this release I thought was absolutely fantastic. I would give it a solid 4.5 out of 5. Same with the audio quality. The audio on this release was absolutely fantastic. I would give it a 4.5 out of 5. As far as extras are concerned, first up, we get Directing a Stranger, an interview with director Fred Walton. At 16 minutes and 35 seconds in length, Mr. Walton discusses making The Sitter, the short film that When a Stranger Calls is based upon. He discusses securing financing to make Stranger. He discusses the locations, working with Carol Kane, Ron O'Neill, Charles Durning, and Tony Beckley. He discusses the sequel briefly, and the 2006 remake, which he says he has no desire to see, but he felt flattered that anyone would want to remake one of his films. Very nice interview interview with Mr. Walton. Next up, we have Carol Kane on When a Stranger Calls. It's 17 minutes and 25 seconds in length. Ms. Kane discusses getting cast in Stranger. She discusses working with Fred Walton and Tony Beckley. She discusses her character and how she developed the character. She discusses her working relationship with Charles Durning, which spanned 5 movies. She discusses the film's success. She also discusses getting involved in the sequel and the evolution of her character from the first film to the sequel. Very nice interview with Ms. Kane. Next up, we get Retanya Alda on When a Stranger Calls. It's 5 minutes and 18 seconds in length. Ms. Alda discusses living in a refugee camp in Germany after World War I. She discusses going to New York to study acting, getting work in plays, and in Brian De Palma's early films, as well as the movies Deer Hunter and Rocky II. She discusses getting the gig in When a Stranger Calls and working with Carol Kane and the popularity of When a Stranger Calls. Next up, we get Scoring a Stranger, an interview with composer Dana Kaproff. It's 7 minutes and 47 seconds in length. Mr. Kaproff discusses growing up in the business and his early gigs as a film composer. He discusses composing the music for When a Stranger Calls and being very happy with how it turned out. He discusses being hired by Daniel Farrens to score his film The Amityville Murders, because Farrens was a big fan of the music that he created for When a Stranger Calls. He briefly discusses composing the music for the sequel as well. We get The Sitter, which is Fred Walton's short film from 1977 that When a Stranger Calls is based upon. It's 21 minutes and 22 seconds in length, and it's pretty good. We also get the 1993 made-for-cable sequel, When a Stranger Calls Back, which I do intend on reviewing, so keep your eyes peeled for that review in the very near future. This is an excellent Blu-ray release from Second Sight Films for When a Stranger Calls. You've got great picture quality and sound quality. You've got some nice extras. You've got the short film from Fred Walton that When a Stranger Calls is based upon, and you've got the sequel, When a Stranger Calls Back, all on one Blu-ray release. If you've not seen When a Stranger Calls, this Blu-ray would be a great way to introduce yourself to the film. If you are a fan of When a Stranger Calls, you definitely want to look into picking up this Blu-ray and adding it to your collection. I'll put a link to Second Sight Films' website down in the description. Go over and check them out. If you've seen When a Stranger Calls, please let me know your thoughts on it down in the comment section below. If you like this video, please leave it a thumbs up. If you're not following me on social media, those links are in the description. They're also right around here. As always, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Take care, and until next time, peace. Join the $1 a Month Club and help support my channel on Patreon. Thank you to my current patrons, Kevin Smythe, Orc145626, B-Movie Mike, Robert Sobel, Turi Delamore, Stephen Flanagan, Lori Holt, Craig Farrand, Farron Sutton, Jeremiah Lambert, Grindhouse Grotto, Joseph Charlesworth, Derek Jana, Demon Waffles, Simon Clark, Stone Gassman, Zachary Barton, James Welch, Eli Geisler, Jeff Overing, Pete Toll, Kyle McGuire, Jay the Stingray, Lauren Dixon, Andrew McDonald, Dave Barnes, Jonathan Lundy, Chris Gonzalez, Trenton Bowser, Jason Breitenbach, and Brandon Bisdick. Say hello to the internet, Jeremy.
Hello to the internet.